Counter-surveillance. Counter-surveillance is a crucial skill the principal must hone to succeed in his endeavors. This chapter discusses both physical and technical surveillance methods at a very basic level, and then discusses counter-surveillance activities for each method to discover whether the adversary is in a probing or targeting phase. This chapter takes liberties assuming the reader is moderately familiar with physical surveillance. This chapter will offer a brief recap of basic surveillance methods, which establishes a basis for how counter-surveillance intends to exploit those surveillance methods. If the reader needs a basic understanding of surveillance, there are plenty of materials available in books and articles that explore surveillance extensively. There are two primary approaches to surveillance: probing and targeting. Probing decides whether the principal or resident is a threat. These surveillance efforts include at least one surveillance operative who may not care if his target sees him. In fact, tail consciousness is an indicator that their target may have training, thus implying some clandestine or nefarious motive. The most important behavior the principal shows is ignorance, even if surveillance is obvious. Targeted surveillance uses robust and professional surveillance teams, if available. This chapter discusses this type of surveillance, because the principal can apply the same methods and techniques of countering larger, well-organized surveillance to smaller, less effective ones. The adversary has surveillance triggers, which are events that prompt the adversary to begin surveillance. These may include an informant, another surveillance operation, or OSINT, and such triggers can fire at any time. Most triggers happen after the resident performs some task to get information or materials. To a lesser extent, the principal may attract surveillance when contacting a resident, loading or unloading caches, or reconnoitering a location that is important to the adversary. Therefore, the principal should conduct surveillance detection before and after any sensitive activities, so he is not leading the adversary to any other clandestine activities or his cover life. Foremost, the only purpose of counter-surveillance is to find the presence of surveillance in a way that does not show an attempt at surveillance detection. Counter-surveillance is not trying to lose surveillance by performing sneaky activities, running lights, or any other nonsense. If the principal recognizes surveillance, he simply cancels the planned activities and continues about his cover life, nothing more. Lastly, the threat of surveillance is not just from the adversary, but may be from neutral or even friendly elements. Witnessing clandestine activities by anyone other than the intended participants may compromise the operation, which makes counter-surveillance activities a high priority for the principal. In an ideal world, friendlies would leave the principal's operations alone, or at least put in the same effort to safeguard the current principal or residents so no one gets hurt. But alas, we do not live in such a world. Greedy or ignorant principals from other organizations may intercept the resident, and because of their lack of understanding or context, may place other lives or the operation in danger. A key part to surveillance is exposure. Too much exposure and the target becomes witting. This is also what surveillance techniques seek to minimize. The two elements to exposure in the context of surveillance are contrast and duration. To mitigate overexposure, surveillance relies on concealment or blending with the surroundings, so the target disregards the surveillance presence. Concealment tries to limit the surveillance's contrast, affording a longer duration. The human mind is constantly trying to conserve resources, so it will disregard objects that fit an ordinary signature. Camouflage contributes to the success of surveillance by making its elements appear indistinguishable. However, the longer any element stays in the view of a target, the more the target will distinguish the finer details. The four types of terrain are urban, rural, suburban, and semi-rural. Each are characterized by the prominence and purpose of man-made features. Urban is heavily laden with man-made features to support various human activities and behaviors, like industrial, commercial, and residential. Human presence is prominent in urban environments. Suburban is a limited form of urban, often restricted to residential housing and limited commercial areas. In suburban areas, human activity, not its presence, is noticeably less than urban areas. The lack of man-made features characterizes rural environments, and human presence is scarce. Semi-rural are those areas that are mostly rural except there is some buildup of infrastructure to support outlying urban developments or human activities. This includes power and communication lines, highways, campsites, trails, and so on. Human presence in semi-rural areas is significantly more than rural, but much less than urban or suburban. Aerial surveillance has expanded in recent years, especially in war-torn regions of the world. The advent of unmanned vehicles has reduced the operating cost of fuel and size, with which its reach and proliferation by many of the world's military and governments show. The practice of its deployment is trying to work its way into more developed regions despite pushback from citizenry. Two more reasons for lack of widespread adoption is current air traffic and platform reliability issues. In more authoritarian regions, aerial platforms continue to grow as safety concerns are low. They are often no-fly zones, and citizens do not have a strong voice. Aerial surveillance capitalizes on some of the benefits of distance over concealment. Unless the platform is too close and mimicking the target's movements, the target will stay oblivious to the platform. Aerial platforms offer the greatest advantage in the rural environment, as it offers the greatest command over great distances. However, these systems are still quite expensive compared to ground surveillance, so the adversary may not develop them unless justified and available. Countering aerial surveillance is a matter of knowing whether it is a threat, and if so, paying attention to the skies and ensuring proper concealment over clandestine activities. At the time of this writing, most aerial platforms are not stealthy. They are loud and obvious. Their operators call these platforms flying lawnmowers because the sound they make even at a distance. One of the only ways to mitigate a target's awareness of aerial surveillance is by flying at higher altitudes. This presents two problems: aviation ceilings and sophisticated equipment. The higher the plane goes, the more the adversary needs coordination with other planes. Furthermore, the platform needs special equipment to stabilize and see in higher detail. The latter contributes to higher procurement and operating costs. Most of the time, aerial surveillance flies at lower altitudes with smaller and less expensive platforms. Fortunately, they are more obvious. If a principal sees this type of surveillance, he cancels all clandestine activities, especially in rural environments lacking overhead coverage or when relationships would be obvious. For example, only two people in the woods go to the same cave or building. However, if working in the urban environments, it is possible to make contact in public venues with dense populations. The principal should use the right techniques described in the Drops chapter. Ground surveillance is the greatest threat to the principal, and especially so in urban environments and developed societies. For non-technical targets, it offers the most valuable information with the highest return on investment. The standard surveillance headcount ranges from 3 to 6 elements. An element can either be a single operative on foot or a vehicular team. Vehicle surveillance employs teams to separate the duties and offer logistical support in the event operatives dismount. Any fewer than 3 elements and the surveillance effort risks overexposure to the target as they rotate with scenery changes. Any more than 6, it becomes a waste of resources and difficult to coordinate due to the lack of qualified operatives and high caseload. The actual number of operatives will depend on the available resources of the surveillance sponsor. If the principal displays counter-surveillance training, then the adversary may dedicate more resources to make it difficult for the principal to spot the effort, despite the greater troubles of coordination and expense. Psychologically, the principal sees his environment in a series of mental snapshots. The principal cannot initially distinguish the surveillance operatives from the general population. At any given location, a person takes a snapshot and keeps it in short-term memory. Subconsciously, the brain compares consecutive snapshots, and if any similarities between geographically or socially distinct locations exist, the brain will bring the snapshots back into consciousness. Once the surveillance rotates through the team, the first elements are available again with less risk of overexposure. Fixed surveillance, albeit simple and straightforward, is inherently difficult to spot. Therefore, progressive surveillance is difficult to see even when there is only one surveillance operative. Counter-surveillance relies on eliciting known responses from the surveillance effort. However, Because fixed surveillance has little or no behaviors or movements, there's not much to elicit from those already in place. As for finding sloppy or intrusive fixed surveillance, people are naturally sensitive to loitering and other unnatural static behaviors. Mobile surveillance is unique because everything from the perspective of the principal is changing: people, vehicles, and the landscape. Therefore, the surveillance must change with the surroundings to minimize the risk of overexposure. Surveillance techniques are a series of pre-planned and rehearsed maneuvers designed to respond appropriately to a normal person's actions and behaviors. Every mobile surveillance starts as fixed surveillance. The pickup is the moment the surveillance acquires the target and the target starts moving. Once both aspects of the pickup meet the above criteria, acquisition and movement, the mobile surveillance begins. The follow is the duration of the mobile surveillance. This is the time where the surveillance effort pursues the target and employs mobile surveillance techniques. After this, mobile surveillance returns to fixed surveillance, known as housing. During the follow, the surveillance effort tries to position its operatives where they can best react to the principal's actions, i.e., maintaining coverage without drawing attention to their presence. Paralleling the principal is most common. It allows the other elements to mostly hide from the principal, yet observe him when he changes direction. The specific positions are A, one element directly behind the principal, known as command; B, one element on each side of the principal, known as parallels; and C, one behind the command, known as backup. This technique is known as the floating box. This box allows the surveillance to pass control between elements smoothly instead of committing the command element with the principal at most turns. This significantly reduces any given element's exposure to the principal greatly. Housing is a box pattern set up after the principal finishes his travels, regardless of a temporary stop or destination. The housing box satisfies three conditions. The positions are at key vantage points where the surveillance can best see the principal without moving. It expands far enough where the surveillance does not have to quickly react to the principal's actions, yet close enough to prevent blind spots, and lastly, to seamlessly join the follow. The key to mobile surveillance is effectively changing the element in command to prevent overexposure. There are three scenarios where surveillance will rotate: during the pickup, direction changes, and during housing. Regarding the pickup and housing, people are most sensitive at points of transition, and people cache these memory snapshots longer than others. Suspicions always arise when others appear to react to a person's behaviors, like leaving home, work, or getting out of a vehicle. Not every change in direction may elicit a change in command. It is common while traveling in a crowd to have a few people with which to turn. To capitalize on this and to save personnel resources, the command element may commit to a few turns before rotation. However, too many consecutive commits is obvious to even the most oblivious people. For surveillance, the limit is usually 3 turns. Any more and the surveillance risks overexposure. The ABC, or street dance, is the term of the maneuver for changing command during the follow. In the traditional floating box, there are 2 elements behind the target and 2 elements paralleling. When the target turns, the elements shuffle in a way that allows them to realign around the target without any of them committing to the same turn. For each turn, the command and backup transition to the parallel positions, and the parallel positions transition to command and backup. Which parallel element becomes what depends on which direction the target turns. Execution is rarely so graceful, as traffics and signals are not always conducive to a perfect execution. The next 2 terms are special and uncommon maneuvers. Cheating is when vehicular surveillance is ahead of the target. The term derives from the passive nature of surveillance because it reacts to the target. If an element is ahead of a target and the target decides to make another turn, the element cannot follow the target without being obvious or reckless. Targets rarely suspect surveillance from the front. Waterfall, performed during foot surveillance, is when the effort ferries operatives in front of the target and then pass in the opposite direction. While this significantly increases the rotation and frequency of when the target can see the team, the target is much less likely to suspect surveillance not only from the front, but traveling in the opposite direction. Detecting ground surveillance capitalizes on the fundamental surveillance maneuvers mentioned above by specifically eliciting these behaviors and then spotting a person or vehicle multiple times. The principle keeps in mind that anyone could be surveillance, but not everyone is. Through the process of elimination, the principle whittles down potential surveillance. The principle suspects those people or vehicles that remain during this detection process. The next phase is confirming suspicions through multiple sightings. The principle performs this process through predefined and previously cased routes and stops. The routes incorporate specific places and behaviors to which surveillance must react while keeping an air of innocence and natural behaviors. The goal is to forcibly rotate the surveillance elements and spot at least one element multiple times. There are two criteria for multiple sightings to be legitimate: geographically and chronologically distinct. The principal should expect to see the same people if he stays in the same geographic area in a short amount of time. However, as he gets further away from an area or is traveling greater durations, multiple sightings should become rarer and thus suspicious. Upon suspicion, the principal cancels all planned activities and tries confirmation, a third sighting of the same person or a second sighting of a second person. Confirmation also raises the risk of compromise. Surveillance detection is a well-known activity only performed by those who conduct clandestine acts. Doing more surveillance detection could confirm the adversary's suspicions, which may force the principal to abandon his operational goals. For example, if the principal plans a 2-hour route, he should abort the remainder of the route if he suspects and confirms surveillance after 45 minutes. Whether the principal ceases further surveillance detection after the second sighting will be up to him, but he must not fall prey to paranoia. The principal conducts surveillance detection activities either in a vehicle or on foot. The principal should incorporate as many techniques without being obvious. If he has a vehicle, he should include both vehicular and pedestrian legs, ranging between 3 to 5 legs and stops for each. If the principal does not have a vehicle, then his circumstances limit him to foot routes, and he should increase the number of legs and stops. The principal considers the use of public transportation as on foot, as the principal can control neither the route nor the access to the vehicle, and the principal cannot consider strangers boarding with him to be suspicious on its own. The use of public transportation is optional. The principal considers taxis as private transportation and thus vehicular when completing legs of a route. The goal of a provocative phase is to confirm the absence of surveillance. However, the provocative phase is not completely reliable because it is impossible to prove the lack of existence. It assumes that the adversary would make itself known if forced into a decision to either lose the principal or prevent a clandestine act. It is therefore optional. The principal may use the provocative phase as a last resort before conducting the most sensitive of activities. Vehicular legs focus more on eliciting surveillance behaviors through the routes between stops instead of the stops themselves. Public roads and parking areas limit vehicle movements and locations. Vehicles are easier to abstract than people because of the lower amount of unique characteristics: make, model, generation, and color. This makes it easier to keep track of vehicles while driving than keeping track of people on foot. When building the vehicular routes, the principal selects stops with at least 3 logical and natural turns between them. Any fewer turns risk elements not rotating during the leg. Adding unnatural turns is known as stair-stepping, which is a provocative maneuver. The principal should avoid using them during the beginning routes. Any turns made within the housing box will not elicit behavior, so the principal must break the box before counting a turn as meaningful. Route paths should never cross. The overall route should have a natural flow. This includes circular, snaking, or linear throughout or between distinct regions. The principal should order the stops in such a way that he conserves both time and effort by minimizing the mileage, but does not neglect the turn requirement. From the perspective of the principal, there are times where the surveillance effort must react to changes in the environment. These include collapsing fanning, changes in proximity, and out of place. The concept of paralleling in the floating box has a flaw. It relies on roads that parallel the target's path. However, natural features and civil design prevents perfect uniformity. When surveillance comes across these obstacles, they collapse behind one another through the obstacle before fanning back out and getting into the box position. There are two benefits to forcing this collapse and fanning behavior. It allows for observation, and it forces the paralleling elements to travel greater distances, potentially hindering coverage. There are two obstacles that force a collapse: corridors and choke points. Corridors are roads or paths that have no paralleling. The principal does this by incorporating routes with differences in speed over distance, natural obstructions, or a lack of infrastructure. Highways are a corridor because vehicles are free to travel at significantly greater speeds than corresponding side roads. Any attempt to drive at highway speeds on a side road is both obvious and dangerous. Naturally obstructed roads follow waterways, bodies of water, mountains, or cliffs. Roads through rural areas are examples of lacking infrastructure. The surveillance effort must travel along the same route as the principal through these obstacles, thus granting him an observation opportunity. Choke points are momentary corridors across some obstacle. The most prominent examples of choke points are bridges and tunnels. Often the principal will see a momentary collapse through the choke point, followed by an immediate fanning. The principal may force surveillance to change proximity by entering traffic obstacles where they would need to close the gap to stay in command. Examples include construction zones, busy roads during rush hour, and areas with heavy traffic control. The surveillance effort will try to get closer during these areas. Conversely, on open roads or freeways, surveillance may draw back and hide among other vehicles. By switching between these dense and sparse areas, the principal may force the surveillance to react accordingly. The principal may quickly drop non-surveillance vehicles by changing the venue, as it is uncommon for people to travel between such distinct areas. Going through distinctly zoned areas like residential, commercial, and industrial, or demographically specific areas will strip away most, if not all, non-threats. Spotting the same people or vehicles in unrelated venues is a strong indicator of surveillance. The principal should incorporate at least one of these elicitation techniques in each of his legs beyond the 3-turn requirement. This will allow for greater solicitation of the surveillance behaviors. The legs must be so logical it does not appear the principal is running surveillance detection. This means he should not go out of his way to incorporate these elements. Rather, these elements should be logical to the principal's route and plans. When the principal executes the legs, he must never break the laws, especially if the adversary is working with law enforcement. If he does, he cannot be certain the ensuing stop, questions, and searches relate to his clandestine activities. Also, behaving so may bring him to the adversary's attention if he was not before. The principal should drive like 80% of the other drivers, neither in the top nor bottom 10% in terms of speed and behavior. When whittling down potential surveillance, the principal should not try to memorize every vehicle in detail to compare later, as that is near impossible for everyone except savants. Instead, the principal allows his mind to abstract the details of those in proximity at planned turns and obstacles. He thinks in terms of vehicle size, type, and color, and then abstracts the occupants in terms of gender, complexion, attire, style, and frame. This allows him to remember more detail to compare later. Any given leg should expose at least 3 surveillance vehicles at a time. Observation post at the beginning of a leg, at least one during the follow, and an observation post at the destination. After 3 legs, the surveillance should have transitioned about 9 times. The principal can disregard certain vehicles and suspect others via turns. At any given intersection, barring any upcoming corridors or choke points, the principal can assume vehicles traveling in a different direction are not surveillance. The principal must pay attention to those who turn with him, potential committed turn, or turn to join him, potential rotation. When the principal crosses a bridge or enters a corridor, only a handful of vehicles may collapse behind him, and fewer still will fan back out after the obstacle. When he changes the venue, only a few will follow. The principal should note these vehicles. When the principal sees vehicles or people a second time, he should obtain a little more detail, observing things like make, model, generation of vehicles, and distinguishing features of the occupants like mannerisms, activities, and unique body and facial features. This will make confirmation more reliable. At the end of the second leg, most, if not all, of the surveillance team would have exposed themselves at some point. This leaves the third leg to do multiple second sightings or a third sighting of one element. The significance of the vehicular stops is to justify the legs. The principal selects stop carefully to support logic in cover and elicit surveillance. When selecting proper stops and legs, the principal ensures they meet both criteria. If a stop or leg does not offer logic and elicitation, the principal does not use it. The stop should lure a surveillance element to enter. This involves a couple of key points. The stop should not be readily observable from outside and should appear in some way that the principal could perform a clandestine act. These key points entice the surveillance to enter with the principal to keep command. This can be most sites, as clandestine acts include brush passes, brief encounters, dead drops, caches, and so on. Each stop should last long enough for the surveillance to house and dispatch a dismount to enter the stop with the principal. However, the stop should be short enough that the principal leaves as the dismount enters, and just as the housing begins to take shape. The theory is it will cause the surveillance elements to scramble to regain command. This may not guarantee a desired response from a well-rehearsed team, but the opportunity may still present itself. The stop should allow for the principal a decent command of both inside and outside the site. He should assess both those who enter and the activities outside. When casing locations, the principal should think like surveillance and find the areas where he would put a surveillance element. That way, if an element is in that position, it is potential confirmation. Each stop along a route should offer different products or services from the other stops. This is from the standpoint of an action cover. It is illogical to go to several convenience stores, as one should satisfy what the principal would need. The stops must fit the principal's natural patterns and behaviors. If he does not smoke, he should not enter a tobacco shop. When using the stop, the principal should behave like any other normal patron. He must not make observation of these areas obvious, as that will confirm the surveillance's suspicions. The principal must follow through with the cover activity. If he appears to talk to someone or buy something, he must not get impatient and leave because the timing was a bit off. The cover takes precedence. The number one rule for foot routes is to act and behave explicitly as it relates to the cover. Surveillance will not give the principal a chance to explain himself. Behaviors that raise more questions will lead to more surveillance and dedicated resources. Instead of eliciting behaviors during the legs, foot routes elicit behaviors at the stops. In vehicles, the principal has mirrors, and surveillance expects him to use them to a certain extent. Vehicles stand out more because they are larger, and it is normal for drivers to look around. The principal does not have these luxuries on foot. Furthermore, people on foot are freer in their movements. They can be in more places and are more difficult to spot without obviously looking around. Operatives on foot can and often are in positions ahead of the principal. There may be one operative following him on the street, but the surveillance can position parallel operatives at subsequent intersections in case the principal attempts clandestine acts immediately after turning. While it is more difficult for vehicular surveillance to get ahead due to the limiting nature of traffic and streets, these restrictions do not apply to operatives on foot. To counter these disadvantages, detection routes build in elements that allow the principal to detect surveillance based on cover stops. The principal first tries to force the surveillance to deploy dismounts. If he enters an area but the surveillance can see his actions without moving, then the principal may not see their surveillance. The principal can use locations that A. obstruct observation from vehicles, B. is difficult for surveillance to cover all entrances and exits, and C. aid the principal in losing command and D is conducive to a clandestine act. These locations should be tight, remote, or heavily trafficked areas like bazaars, markets, malls, piers, town or city centers, recreational or amusement parks, and so on. Once the principal arrives to an area, he will do so in a vehicle, be it private or public. The surveillance effort will set up housing around that point of transition if it is how the principal will leave. This is either where he parked his vehicle or a public transportation stop. The principal must travel on foot beyond the limits of this housing box. This forces the surveillance to deploy dismounts. The principal selects stops that have varying degrees of purpose. The goal here is to take the surveillance team out of their comfort zone or generality or ambiguity. If he goes into special purpose locations, especially those with helpful staff or social patrons, the principal may see stumbling or distraction as the operative tries to look natural while performing his job. His mistake is not a guarantee, but the situation presents a potential opportunity. The more operatives used, the higher the chance an operative will make a novice mistake. The fewer operatives used, the more likely the principal will spot the same operative multiple times. The principal may consider using stops that organize around a specific activity. If he goes to a social gathering, like a hobbyist get-together, business networking meeting, or some athletic meet, surveillance will stand out if not prepared. However, there is no guarantee because professional surveillance researches and knows what to expect from the principal, but it may present a potential opportunity. The principal avoids using stops which are outside his natural patterns. As mentioned before, the use of public transportation is more akin to foot than vehicular, primarily because surveillance can board with the principal and see his activities within. Think of this as a cover stop that takes the principal to different areas. While it may be tempting to select a seat with command over the rest of the vehicle, surveillance may consider this a counter-surveillance flag. If the situation presents the principal an opportunity to do so, then he may capitalize on it. Otherwise, he selects a seat like anyone else. If the surveillance can predict the principal will board a bus, surveillance will try to have an operative on board prior to him entering. They will also have others in position at stops ahead so the command does not feel pressured to exit when the principal does. As the principal passes manned stops, surveillance will leapfrog to the bus's scheduled stops. Subways, although not always available, are great because surveillance cannot easily see the principal within, thus forcing dismounts into the stations and onto the trains. Subways impede communications and, with their bidirectional nature, makes it harder to predict and react to the principal's travels. It is also good to travel between demographically distinct areas, even though it makes the principal stand out more. If it fits his cover, it matters little. In response, the surveillance will either continue to rotate operatives as normal or limit only those proper operatives to continue the surveillance. Regardless, this gives the principal more detection opportunities. When it comes to execution, the principal must have a logical plan and execute it properly. The focus is normal behaviors that have a byproduct of detection opportunities, not forcing detection opportunities and trying to mimic normal behaviors. If the principal appears to shop, then he must shop, but builds in detection opportunities. If the situation becomes uncomfortable or deviates from his plan, the principal should not hesitate to cancel activities.